Esteemed guests, good evening. Welcome to the 6th installment in our 50th anniversary screening series. My name is Alberto Zambenedetti, and I have the good fortune of being the director of the Cinema Studies Institute. Before we proceed, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I also wish to thank the colleagues that have made the series possible at Innis College: Ian Logan, Megan McDonald, Ben Westrate, Shayla Anderson, and Charlie Kyle. At CSI, James Cahill, Corinne Columper, Bliss Lim, Tony Pai, and Denise Ng. And at Media Commons, Dylan Reixey, David Pasco, and Christina Stewart. For those of you who were not able to come to our first 5 screenings, let me give you a bit of context for this series. 2025 is a special year for the Cinema Studies Institute. It was in 1975 that the cluster of film courses taught at the University of Toronto since 1969 was granted the status of a college program. Cinema Studies was then housed officially at Innis College, where it has remained ever since. In 2007, the college program became an institute and first developed graduate offerings for MA students in 2007 and then PhD students in 2013. Today, we teach approximately 2,500 undergraduate students per year, 300 of which are program students, meaning minor, major, or specialists, and we have about 55 graduate students in our MA and PhD programs combined. CSI graduates have gone on to pursue careers in all corners of the profession, from the film industry to academia, from programming to criticism, to becoming novelists in Canada and abroad. By all standards, CSI has become one of the premier locations in the world to study cinema. The 50th anniversary series is meant to celebrate this long and storied history and the people who contributed by shaping it. But it's also an opportunity to think about the students who will join us in the future and whose careers we hope to launch. And for this reason, I invite you to contribute to donating to our Cinema Studies Fund. There's a surprisingly convenient QR code in the slide behind me, should you be inclined to do so. And now to the main event. It is my privilege to introduce tonight's distinguished guest and alum, Jesse Wente. Born and raised in Toronto, Jesse's family comes from Chicago and Genabajit Nisha Beck, and he's off-reserve member of the Serpent River First Nation. Jesse is best known for more than 2 decades spent as a columnist for CBC's Radio Metro Morning, first as a film critic and then as a culture critic. He was a regular columnist on Q, Unreserved, and more than 20 local CBC stations. He has programmed for the Imaginative Film Festival and Media Festival and the Real World Film Festival. Jesse joined the Toronto International Film Festival in 2006 as a member of the Canadian Features Programming team, and in 2010 he became the director of film programs for the festival's year-round venue, Bell Lightbox, and would eventually oversee the organization's theatrical repertory, film circuit, and the gallery programming. Among the many retrospectives that Jesse presented while at TIFF, were shows featuring the films of Stanley Kubrick, Michael Mann, Kelly Reichardt, Studio Ghibli, Keanu Reeves, Tim Burton, and Ida Lupino. In 2012, Jesse presented First People Cinema, the largest retrospective of global indigenous cinema ever mounted to that point. It was accompanied by a gallery exhibition, Home of Native Land, co-curated with Stephen Loft. In 2016, Jesse was blanketed at a ceremony at the Imaginative Festival in recognition of his contribution to Indigenous screen storytelling. He was also named the inaugural recipient of a Real Activist Award from the Real World Film Festival. In 2018, he received the Association of Ontario Health Centre Media Award. And in 2018, Jesse was named the founding director of the Indigenous Screen Office, and in summer 2020, he was appointed chair of the Canada Council for the Arts. Jesse received the Arbor Award from the University of Toronto in 2021 for his volunteer contributions and was recently appointed as senior fellow at Massey College. His memoir, Unreconciled: Family, Truth, and Indigenous Resistance, is a national bestseller and was picked as one of the best books of 2021 by Chapters Indigo, Apple Books, and the Globe and Mail. Jesse was awarded the Rakuten Kobo Emerging Writer in Nonfiction for Unreconciled. Jesse is currently working on his next writing project and maintaining a busy speaking schedule through the National Speakers Bureau. He is also an avid golfer, currently with a 10.5 handicap. He includes in his biography. I don't know what that means, but later you can explain it to me. And he received, this is the most important piece of data for us, is received this honors Bachelor's of Arts degree with a cinema studies specialization in 1996, which is why we claim it as our own. Please join me in welcoming Jesse Wente.
Thank you. We got the full Wikipedia on that one, folks. Thank you, Alberto. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out on this evening and for watching these films, which are rarely screened these days. So I'm so happy you'll be able to see them. It's interesting to stand up here on the stage. I think the last time I did that is when I got married to my wife in this very room, and she's just sitting over there. I think we were the first wedding, maybe the only wedding ever conducted here, because we met in this room. She was the projectionist of my Cinema 101 class that Charlie taught, and she broke the rules and dated a student, and 30 years later, we're here. More than 30 years. Whatever math it is, let it math. So anyway, very thrilled to be here. About these two films, so these films, one of the Incident Restigouche is by Alanis Obomssawin, the famed Abenaki filmmaker who's spent her entire career working with the National Film Board. She's made, I think, 57 movies at this point. This is an early one for her, and probably certainly at the time, the most influential film that she had made. It was broadcast, I saw it on CBC in 1984. It was broadcast. And it sort of traveled extensively for one of her movies at the time. And it was often paired with Bastion Point-Day 507 on the International Film Festival circuit. That's why they're paired here today, because this is actually how they were paired. And Merata and Alanis met for the first time because of these two films being paired. They met at, in fact, in Guelph of Ontario for a screening of this program. And Merata and Alanis ended up becoming best friends. We often refer to them as the grandmothers of global Indigenous cinema. It's through their meeting and their sort of relationship and friendship that I would certainly point to the reason I'm here as a big reason when they got together. And Lauren and I can talk all about them in the Q&A, but that's really why I wanted to show these movies, why I screened this program back at that retrospective you mentioned. And I've done it a couple of times, and you'll also see the movies do speak to one another. So not only, in 1983 or 84, when they would have been touring, you have two films made by two Indigenous women filmmakers. As a programmer, that would be attractive to pair together. And as you'll see, they're very similar in what they're about. They're both activist cinema. They're both films about protest occurring. And so they're also thematically tied. In terms of their approach, they're quite different. Merata would end up going on to make feature films and really move away from documentaries in her later career, and Alanis has only ever made documentaries to this day. So I don't know what format we're screening them in. Do you know? DCP? DCP, that's fantastic. I don't think I've ever seen Bastion Point on a DCP, so I very much look forward to that. And enjoy the films, and Lauren and I will be here for a Q&A afterward. Thank you very much. Miigwech.
Bastion Point, green patch in an urban desert, enclave of valuable real estate, ancestral land of the Ngati Whatua tribe since mid-18th century, centred in Auckland, New Zealand's largest city. In 1976, government released plans to develop Bastion Point, which included an exclusive housing estate. Ngati Whatua pressed claims for land to be returned. The Crown had guaranteed possession. The Crown had granted inalienable title. The Crown had taken it away. The Crown was asked to give it back.
We have stood up against the might of the Crown, and we're not big men, but let them come and try and evict us off here, we'll have so many people on Bastion Point. We want that kite to fly. We want that flag to fly. We want this house to stand because this is the basis of our pleas.
It was from here to the train when one of the wardens started talking French. It wasn't a warden, it was a QPP. We didn't understand what he was saying, so we stood aside. And he says, get out of the way, but where can you go if you get out of the way? You can't jump in a river. So we stood there. They had enough room to go by. As soon as they came up to us, they started beating us up.
We seen very clearly what they were doing. They all marched in and they took Donald Germain and handcuffed him and beat him and dragged him to the beginning of the wharf. They made him kneel down and they had his head to the ground. He couldn't move any way he wanted to. If he did, they banged him up with nightclubs. And they were long sticks.
I was staggering. So the guy tells me to kneel. I wasn't going to kneel for anybody. So I got knocked down over there again.
The wardens took nets that were in the river, and the police threatened people for information. Garages and backyards were invaded and nets seized. Some of the nets were destroyed with knives and left behind.
Jesse will be in conversation with Professor Lauren Cramer, whose work focuses on the aesthetic of blackness and popular culture. She's currently working on a book on hip-hop visual culture and black spatial practice and has published writing on a variety of art objects, including worldstarhiphop.com, the videos from Jay-Z's 444, Peter Eisenman's architectural designs, and Meghan Markle's wedding. Lauren is the founding member of Liquid Blackness, a research project on blackness and aesthetics, and she's the co-editor of Liquid Blackness Journal of Aesthetics and Black Studies, which is published by Duke University Press. Her writing has appeared in the Journal of Cinema Media Studies, The Black Scholar, Black Screen Media Camera, Film Criticism, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Quarterly Review of Film and Video, Decalogue, and the edited collection Writing for Screen Media, which was published by Routledge in 2019. Please join me in welcoming Jesse and Lauren.
Thank you so much for joining us for the screening. Jesse, thank you for being here to talk about these films. I'm really excited to get into it. So one of the funny things for people who've taken film studies classes is one of the first pieces of advice you get is this completely contradictory thing. We say, oh, you should study film because you love movies. And then you take a film class and we say, if we're talking seriously about movies, it doesn't matter if you liked it or not, because we have to study this. It gets serious. And I don't believe that. So I want to just start by, if you could tell us a little bit about your feelings about this film. Maybe, and especially, I could imagine that this is an ongoing relationship, like seeing it on TV is one thing, and then on a festival circuit, and then an occasion like this, one's relationship to the films change. So can you tell us a little about it?
It goes. Thank you, Lauren. It's even a deeper relationship than just that. Because I saw it in 1984. It was broadcast on I can't never remember if it was CBC or TVO. Because TVO for a long time was working with NFB to release Alanis's films. But anyway, I saw it in 1984. The thing that struck me at that time was that Alanis looked amazingly like my mother. And I had just never seen someone like my mother on screen in that way, arguing with a minister. And we can talk about, because there's a whole backstory to their relationship. But so that was really interesting to me. And it was also a movie that sort of activated my own understanding that my community, and I'm Anishinaabe, not Mi'gmaq, but we're cousins, our nations, and it was a beginning to understand of like, oh, I don't think Canada always views us as like friendly folks. So it was an awakening around. It was very much a political awakening as well as a film awakening, because I was already a movie-obsessed kid. By the time I saw this, I would have been like 11 or 10 or 11 years old. But I'd never seen a movie like this. And this sort of changed my idea of what a movie could be and what it could actually say and how someone like me might have a role in films as opposed to just dying on the back of a horse, which was sort of what I had seen before. Now, since then, yes, I've programmed the movie, I've shown it endless times. I think the more interesting story to tell, though, is that my wife, who I introduced you to all at the beginning, who I met in this room, she's from Campbellton, which is the city across the bridge from Restigouche. And so, and we've been so I've now gone to this region. It's very much my second home. I love, it's an amazing part of Mi'gmaq, this area. It's now called Listuguj, the reserve. It's not Restigouche anymore. But so I've really fallen in love, and just watching it now is like watching, like I know all of these spots. And then there's another layer, which is when I start to see the last names, and and some of the faces, because these are now families that I have a relationship with, including, one of my my dear friends. He's no longer with us, but he, Jeff Barnaby, the very acclaimed. That's his community, Listuguj, and he would often, and as you saw, one of his uncles in the movie, and he set. If you ever saw his zombie movie Blood Quantum, the main action sequence takes place on that bridge that you see in that movie, and he often talked about the events of not only just his family living through these events, but also it being somewhat of a cinematic awakening, like seeing Alanis, understanding that this is a role you could have, and you could tell your community's story through film. And that broadcast that I reference, it seems every Indian that went into movies saw that broadcast, because that screening or that show, if you ask a lot of us of my generation anyway, we all watched that, and we all had that very similar transformation. So it's a really layered. When I see Incident Restigouche, my relationship with now is deeper than maybe any other movie I can name. And even sitting here, just watching it again, it was just a flood of everything, of the people and everything. For those that are interested, Alanis went back. She often does this, where when she's made a movie in a community, those are relationships that she maintains for life. Like, if you know her very first film, Christmas was Moose Factory, which was about kids at the residential school, Moose Factory. She, to this day, makes blankets for the kids in Moose Factory, right? That's 50 some odd years ago. She's still doing that. So she went back 20 years later. She made another film called The Crown is at War with Us, which is all about what happened since. And just for the folks in the audience to know, they still have these disputes, the government and the Mi'gmaq fishers. And just in the last few years, there was an incident where you had white fishers setting fire to some of the Mi'gmaq fisher boats, and big confrontations. So it's still an ongoing dispute over the fisheries there, and so it's still very much a live subject.
One of the reasons why I always like to start by asking these, just what is one's relationship to the film, is because I am interested in the kinds of kinship that form around cinema. So this idea of everyone from my generation who has kind of gone this route, somehow we're all watching TV at the same time. I sort of love that moment. Can you tell us a little bit more about the friendship between these filmmakers so we can think about the relationship that's also happening kind of off screen, but alongside these films circulating and being made?
Yeah, so Alanis and Merata come from very similar places in terms of their filmmaking. They both started as activists, really, and storytellers in their community. And the impulse to make films was very similar, which was stuff was happening, and so let's go film it. And as you can very much get that sense in the Bastion film of like, let's just go and shoot, and that's what we're gonna witness, and that's what that film really is. Alanis, sort of the stuff had happened, and so she had to go back and many years to make the film, but it was the same sort of idea, like stuff is happening, let's go shoot. And in Canada, the NFB had started something called the Indian Film School in the late 1960s to train Indigenous people, and it was the same sort of idea, those films had that same sort of instantaneous quality of like, an event is occurring, we have no agenda other than we're going to witness what happens. And she very much comes from that tradition. So they met, the films were paired for very obvious reasons. Like I think curators were right. Like I don't think it's a racist thing at all. Like I think you watch those two movies, they are related and they're speaking to each other from one side of the world to the other. So they met, they became, I would always describe them as warriors as much as anything, but very good friends. And they would tour the world because they would meet each other at film festivals constantly because they were always sort of paired together, and they just became the closest of friends. And I think that relationship, Merata's son Heppy, I know very well. Like it spawned. Sundance has a Merata Mita Award, so there's this huge, like they did go global, and they, through their sort of relationship and the fact that they made movies that were akin, like they were of the same, but then different. I think was an example for all of us, a sort of like, this is maybe how you do it in our way, and by that I mean like a First Nations approach to filmmaking and building those bonds of filmmaking. And it's why Indigenous cinema developed as a global cinema, and why I would describe it you can't classify it like a national cinema, because it occurred pretty much simultaneously all over the world in very similar ways, because all the films are almost always documentaries and always activist documentaries, because that's what the need was at the time. But it's why we all, Eritrea, here, Australia, the indigenous film landscape in all of those places took shape at pretty much the exact same time. And I also think it's key that they were women, and that indigenous cinema as a tradition, unlike every other cinema, is a tradition of women. And that to this day, Indigenous women are the primary filmmakers in our community. Like back when I was advocating for funds for Indigenous filmmakers, I would always say, if you fund Indigenous cinema, you fund women filmmakers, because that's what this is. That's why, and I think that has also meant that women experience the cinema space in our world very differently. Not totally differently, but I think much differently in terms of they are recognized as the leaders of this and the folks who started this. And so they have a lot of, like to this day, most of the major Indigenous films are made by women.
I think the reason that I ask about their relationship is precisely what you said about this sort of like geographic relation that is so much more complex than in these two films, we're watching people try to frame a conflict in real time. And so that I think that one of the things that's so important here is being able to see, again, this sort of kinship, different but similar, and that not being a conflict, and also not something that needs to be erased. Like, yes, the context here are different, but that these things can exist together. I think it just goes to show the nature of this relationship about negotiating either actual space and cinematic space is way more complex than this sort of very simple approach to geography, right? That's so clearly defined, right? And so even though I really love stories about kinship and the sorts of relationships that form around the practice of filmmaking, these are films about conflict. And so I'm curious about how you can help us understand what the sort of narrative or aesthetic possibilities of conflict are. Like, what does that activate? Like, a lot of stories need to be told, all of the stories need to be told, but here we're prioritizing a story of conflict. And so what's important about that?
I mean, I think it represents a certain aspect of First Nations existence under colonial rule, which is that there's always conflict, both internal, which I think you see. Like, I think you see people. There's a great moment in Bastion where one of the protesters is being led away by a Maori cop, and he says, "Look, we're the same skin," and so I think there's you sort of get all of that internal and external is sort of right there. I also think it's just a function of the time. Like I think it's a function of a few things. It's the function of the interest of the filmmakers. Like, so they're activists. So for them, protest, this is what they did, right? So the idea of let's go film it, very natural to see where they would arrive, sort of come to that conclusion. It's also, I think, key to understand that it is all, because both of them, if you watch the credits, right, were funded by the colonial states, that they are. So I think it's also key to understand that part of the history of Indigenous cinema is what we could make, not what necessarily we wanted to make. And this is, I think, true of a lot of marginalized cinemas or cinemas that grow from people that are marginalized, is that they don't always get to make the movies they want to make. They make the movies they can. And I think one of the realities is that colonial nations know the story of the colonial sort of side of it, and they're quite comfortable in having those stories told. And so in terms of like, well, sure, you can go make this. That's sort of the permission structure that exists. It was much harder to make a movie about Indigenous joy, because that's unknown to colonial people. Like, they don't understand that, right? And frankly, it's far more threatening than our anger. And so I think you always have to keep in mind that some of Indigenous cinema is shaped by what was able to be made. And like, Alanis exists in an incredibly privileged position. No other filmmaker on earth has worked for the same studio for 50 straight years and had that ability like that. And I would argue rightly so. Like, I think for many years, Alanis is the justification for the NFB's existence. Like, I'm not sure without her, we would still have the National Film Board. So I think she's that important. But it is that sort of function. And then the one thing I would say, certainly about Restigouche, is it was a fight to make that movie. They did not want her to appear on screen. So this is the first film Alanis has seen. In all of her films, you and I talked a little bit about this. I mean, she makes movies really starting with sound. So her process is she visits the community with a tape recorder first, no cameras. And she'll do a bunch of interviews that way and start building the relationships. Then she returns with one camera and sort of starts doing a little, and then, so it's this this is why it's amazing that she's made that many movies, because her process is quite attenuated. And so they didn't want her to appear on screen. They didn't want her to interview Lucien Hussard, because no Indigenous media member had ever interviewed a minister up until that moment. They didn't want her to ever narrate any of her movies. So she fought, and I say that word literally. I mean, literally punches were thrown in order to get this movie made in the way that it appears. Because she refused. She said, the whole point is for me to go interview him. Like, there's no point sending a white reporter. You don't get this. So it was a real battle, and I think it shows. And then the story I would want to tell quickly is Alanis, whenever she would invite someone to Montreal to do an interview, she would take them to this famous seafood restaurant in Montreal. So she took Hussard there in that ridiculous outfit he was wearing. It's just an absurd clothing choice. And they had a absolute falling out, like just screaming at each other in this restaurant very publicly. This is like where all the Quebec politicians in Montreal go. Like everyone was witness to this. And he refers to it where he says like at noon, at one point he says, at noon you told me this thing. He's talking about the lunch they had just had earlier that day where they were yelling at each other. And this is why he appears like his shirt's already unbuttoned because he's already been through it with her. Like he's already like, this is a disaster. And so like, he's instantly disheveled because he's gone through this whole day. And then she just roasts him like that. And I mean, it's the most Alanis moment maybe in all of her films where she's just in like full on there and unwilling to let anything go. And I mean, no wonder she became all of our idol with that movie, right? Like, I don't know how a 10-year-old Anishinaabe kid is supposed to see that without going, can I do that? Because my community, we have it's the same. Like they took all of our hunting grounds. Like my family's traditional hunting grounds isn't on the res, but so that's on Crown land. And my cousin goes and shoots a moose on that Crown land every year against the law, and his theory is always, come get me. Let's do it. Like, and they never do because they know this is what happens. You end up losing. Because the end of the story should be that the Listuguj, that nation, they have the fishing rights now. Oh, you must get their permission to fish on the river. And because of that, the reserve is quite, like they have their own high school, they've got their own police force, because they were able to fight to regain those rights. So and then with Merata, she was very much a frontline activist, literally right before this movie. So this is her community on screen that she went to film, and she was a ferocious woman. And they're akin to like that. They just weren't willing to, they wanted change, and they just weren't willing to abide by anything that wouldn't allow that. And they were matriarchs, so they were mothers, and they were there to like, we're changing this. And hers was a fight too. Like it was not shown in Eritrea for a long time, and then just because, well, you can see why they didn't want to watch it. And so for her as well, it was a huge fight. And then you'll notice that the events take place like 2 or 3 years before the films were released, and that was just a process of that battle to get the films out. And I think it's in the end, historically, it's quite fabulous that they were paired, because I don't know how much of this rest of the stuff would have happened if they didn't end up meeting and having this, and then having this friendship across oceans for the rest of their lives.
So how does this how do you see this activist spirit and purpose and like practice, like long-term ongoing way of working? How do you see that showing up in film form? Because it matters, if we're talking about, like the phrase you use is narrative sovereignty. Like if we're thinking about that, it also, these things work differently depending on where we're having the fight. And so when it moves to cinema, how does it show up there? Or how does it become something specific in that medium?
I'm not sure it always does. In terms of like the development of a First Nations like cinema language, is that what we're talking about?
It doesn't necessarily, I don't think, have to be this sort of applying to a First Nations like cinematic language, like, oh, this is how you know it when you see it. But I think that for me, like the tension between movement and stillness in these two films, sure, like that tension, even in this sort of like guerrilla, like low budget sort of filmmaking practice, that is incredibly powerful and sophisticated, the way that sound, stillness, and movement are working in this film, or in both of the films.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's hard for me to know at this moment what was function and what was intentional. Because like I think some of it was they were working with the materials they've got. Alanis's approach is very, it's always been the same. And I call her cinema the cinema of listening, because it's not like other movies in that it is very sound based. Her voice is incredibly important to her films, both the sound of it, but also the idea that their films are very much made from her perspective. So like that sort of unvoiced, but her literal voice, I think, is something to the movies. Like it's hard to imagine her cinema without her voice in them. And the films listen in a way that I'm not sure I've ever really encountered. Like her really philosophy is she wants the audience to hear from the people. And so, but to listen. So it's not about showing. Like in a weird way, I think she could have done most of her work just as an audio form. Like sometimes the camera seems very secondary to her approach. Because for her always, she didn't camera operate necessarily, but she did sound. So she would have this, I am sure it's not the same anymore, but she had her Nagra, like the sound recorder, like on this, wrapped around her, and she'd walk with her mic. Like if you ever get to see old, that's her uniform on set. So hers is her form has really largely been unchanged. It's quite amazing. Subtle little shifts, but like from Christmas's Moose Factory right to the most recent film, they're of a style, and yeah, listening is probably the thing. Merata's films are always a little bit more in your face. The watching them here, what I was struck by was that Merata builds the tension in that film really expertly. Like there's just this building of suspense, and you're like worried and anxious about what's going to happen. Whereas I think that's partially a function of she made features like that too. So like it's sort of her style, but also I think she was there during the protests, whereas Alanis is sort of coming in after. So I think it's a slightly different thing. And I would say that when Alanis released the film, that interview with Lessard became legendary, because like that was not. I mean, I don't know how many of you have like Canadian media of the '70s, and that's not the sort of interview people did with politicians like ever in this country. And I know the producers of the interview were aghast that she had, like they were sort of embarrassed that she had behaved that way, which is
There was no pressure to remove it?
Oh, there was tons of pressure.
Because it's mortifying for him.
Oh yeah, it is.
Okay.
Oh, it is. It's cringing it's very cringe for him. There was a lot of pressure to move it, but she refused. Alanis has Final Cut and has had Final Cut as far as I've forever, certainly since this movie. So yeah, like nothing is in her films that isn't what she wanted.
Her son talks about her filming so often that her films don't feel like images, but rather like memories. And so I think that this idea of like, well, she was there filming, and so that's how you're getting this sort of different sense of time. But I think that for me, something about pausing, getting these moments of black and white photography, it creates an effect of, it's part of, for me, sort of the worry, because it feels like this moment that is frozen, and I'm wondering if it's lost already. It's something about, I think, a set of, I don't know, a nostalgia that can sometimes exist when you're looking at the still image. Yeah.
There's something blunt about the black and white images, right? That they're sort of like a newspaper grade. That it sort of robs it of the romanticism that you might have of like them singing the hymn. Like it's just a stark sort of image. And then in that film, it's always the fact that they take away all the elders, and it's like, wow, that is something. That is something.
And I wonder if this isn't about these films, it's about your work. But I think that the reason why love this idea of people working in an activist space and then deciding, and then teaching and then moving into film, and they're thinking about all of these different mediums, all of these aspects of their practice. Like, you similarly are working and writing across different modes and genres. I wonder, like, do you feel like you're thinking about, or I'm sure certainly you're thinking about, but can you tell us a little bit about how you think about where you are placing work and the modes in which you work in when you want to be telling stories?
Oh boy, I wish I had a really great answer for you, Lauren. That was like intentional and well thought out. I would say, upon reflection, I would say that my work is largely about stories, and film is the first mode of storytelling that I fell in love with. So it has occupied the largest part of my space, and I do think there's a magic to it as a storytelling form that is unparalleled. And you mentioned, to me, films are like dreams, and I think they allow us, because our dreams are edited, right? Like, no one thinks, we don't dream in like a continuous one shot. It's we cut to the good stuff typically in the dreams, and I think when they're at their peak, they can sort of take you to that dreamlike space, and they can be real in a way that dreams can be real, that I think other art forms can struggle with. But in the end, I'm most interested in story, and I'm interested in the politics around story, who gets to tell them, why, what stories are told, the influence those stories can have. And in terms of where I then do my work, it's sort of where, these days, it's where I feel like I can do it and retain the most sort of truth to myself while I do it. Filmmaking, it's a challenge. There's many people involved these days with the way financing is structured. It requires a lot of give and take and a lot of compromise. It always has, but I think ever more so. Layer in like a First Nations filmmaker or anything like that, more so. And I've produced a couple movies. I can't say they went great, mostly for reasons outside myself. So I these days I sort of place it where I can be comfortable doing it and feeling that I can give you my authentic voice. That's why in the end, I was a guy who went to film school and ended up on the radio for 25 years, which was bizarre. But I loved radio as a medium because it was ephemeral at the time. It's not anymore because of podcasts. But at the time, you could do it and it went away. So then you didn't have to, it was gone. And it's a very intimate medium. And I also had, at the end there on the radio, full editorial control, very much like Alanis, right? Like I had achieved enough success where I could say whatever I wanted, really, and they were going to let it go. And that interests me. So I'm interested where I can say what I want to say without, to be honest, without colonial folks getting in the way of it. And so these days that's in books where I can write and talks. I do a lot of talks where it's just me on stage, and no one bugs. Like, I can do whatever I want, and that works. And yeah, movies, they seem like something I won't do again. I don't say no to, so I could, but it's not the primary focus.
So I think this is my last question before I open it up, because I do want to, I'm sure there are questions. And it is similarly about control, because you've actually been in these classrooms, with, the CSI faculty. And so now that you're not in the classroom, so you can give us some notes. I'm curious about, we are trying to tell a certain story about film history. And I'm curious about what you think happens to teaching this work, or or for someone who wants to be a student of film studies, if this is where we start? If we said, okay, let's start with the grandmothers of global indigenous cinema, and that's the beginning of the story, as opposed to elsewhere you've noted, like, oh, Stagecoach is a certain sort of beginning of the story. What if this is the start? How does that change, I think, what it might be like to sit in a classroom and learn about film?
I would think it would change it a lot. Yeah, I think, I mean, I was trained here. It's in the 90s. So my brain sort of goes, it's the beginning and it's also not the beginning. Because Alanis and Merata didn't exist in a vacuum. They were products of their age and products of their time, and as well as the movies that they were interested in. And Merata had a husband who was also a filmmaker. And they moved, Barry and Merata moved to Los Angeles at some point. I would love to take that course. I think that would be very interesting. Obviously when I went here, there was no Indigenous cinema course. I don't think that's a fault of the university. There was barely Indigenous cinema, right? It hadn't happened yet. Like the global movement of Indigenous cinema didn't really occur until the late 1990s. So I was long out of university. I do think it would be, I think the interesting thing is if you started here, it would make the screening of Stagecoach more interesting. And like Stagecoach is an interesting film, sort of, and from a formal standpoint. And I always recommend people watch the stunt work, because the stunt work is where the actual Indigenous people in that movie exist, and they are fantastic. Because that's all in-camera horse riding and just unbelievable stunts in that film. But I think it would inform some of those. Like if you watch that and then did Westerns, you might have a somewhat different understanding of what is operating. And I think that would be, would reframe much, which I think for my generation, we did that anyway. Because I knew these films when I came here. Right, so I was already sort of interested in moving past, I was obsessed with Black cinema because that was the closest I could get to an Indigenous sort of cinema, where it was okay, this is interesting. We're rejecting, and we're pushing, and so yeah, I think anything where you could maybe recast some of the cinema history, because I think what would be interesting to me is the tension is that now you're actually not teaching cinema history. If you show that and then you show Stagecoach, now you're teaching something else. Yeah, you can talk about cinema, but you're teaching the history of this place in a sort of interesting way.
Yeah, I just think it's an interesting exercise to me to think about. When we kind of think about conflict, how might that work if we understand what people are fighting for in a different sort of way that is not always a sort of reactionary thing? Can in the semester, I think, maybe we can get to joy. We have enough weeks to get to joy if we start here sometimes, right? If not, you start at one place and you get to, and so we're resisting. And I just wonder, maybe we have time for joy in the semester if we.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I mean, I think joy in terms of a subject or something that we see represented in Indigenous cinema is relatively new. And I think that's because people weren't looking for it. And by that I mean funders weren't looking for that sort of thing. In the most Canadian of ways, what happened was the Americans made a couple Indigenous comedies, and the Canadians were like, "Oh, maybe we should do that." And now we have a bunch of hit Indigenous comedies here. The sadness is, of course, that we could have had those shows, including the ones that were made in America, here 20 years ago, 30 years. Those were all sitting on they're sitting on a shelf in CBC development hell or something. These were all shows that could have been made. We just weren't given the opportunity. But I think now there's Julie and I went and saw the premiere of North of North, which is a CBC, it's the first sitcom ever set in Iqaluit. Loads of fun, lots of joy. Lots of joy, lots of sex, all the sort of fun stuff of life in that movie. But that's like brand new. Like it's not that, well, your community's sort of the same. Like there's not been a lot of joy for Black cinema. Like it's relatively recent. Just because I think our trauma is always a little bit more palatable for folks, because they sort of get that because that's their side of the story. So they can like, hey, yeah, I get that.
Absolutely. And it's still, putting a certain group of people at the center, because it's kind of like, oh, well, our trauma is always a reaction to this center sort of thing. But in fact, no one would be fighting or resisting if it wasn't because of all of these other aspects, these relationships that are sustaining communities. You wouldn't, if community wasn't there, then this is what we are trying to preserve.
You resist for the joy. Yeah, you got it.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, thank you. So I have been selfish and been asking all the questions myself, but are there any questions in the audience we should take? Oh, now I don't feel bad. This is wonderful. We're good? So if, while people are milling around in the spirit of like community, like let us know if you want to come up and have kind of one-on-one talks or to share your opinions about the film, because the opinion part in fact does matter in the film. Like how did it make you feel? But thank you so much. Oh, I'm sorry. I see one here. Do you wanna...
We've got a microphone.
Sorry, this isn't a especially well thought out question, and I'm not like a cinema student, so I was like waiting for other people to ask questions. But one thing that struck me a lot, sort of visually, was the sort of the violence of the cops in both movies, despite the lack of like guns. So I'm from the U.S., and so for me it was like, first of all, it's just like, just visually, it's like, wow, look at all these cops, and in the one case, they've only got night batons, but then the other case, they're not even like carrying weapons, but still like the sort of violence that they're clearly willing to perpetrate, and the sort of like feeling that you get while watching them is so intense. So I guess I'm wondering if, and I don't know if this is exactly a film studies question, but I guess I'm curious about whether and to what extent, like, how do you think of the way that the sort of audience kind of reception of what's going on would have been different across the world, even at that time, or across the world at this time? Because there's something that's really very stark about just like seeing these things compared to what I, see a lot of nowadays and in recent years. So I'm sort of curious about that aspect of things.
Yeah, so I think the reception was that most people were still pretty shocked. Now I think at the time New Zealand police didn't carry guns, sort of like the British, so they weren't necessarily toting around sidearms. The Canadian cops definitely had guns. 100% they had guns. The Canadian cops always have guns when they come to our protest. That's their favorite thing to have. You could watch any number of other Alanis films and you'll see cops doing all sorts of shooting. So quite common. And to be honest, like those images are the same. If there was a protest against mining companies in downtown Toronto and the police on horseback were there today. The Canadian government set in snipers and armed forces to remove folks from unceded territory, which means there's no treaty. It's not Canada. But Canada sent in their army to remove protesters out BC just a couple of years ago. Like, this is still common colonial practice, is that when we occupy the lands we have occupied since time immemorial, they send the cops or the army or whatever. So it was pretty shocked at the time, and I would say from sitting in the audience, still pretty shocking for folks. But what I would say is not at all shocking from where I sit. This is what we face when we step up to protect what's ours. So not at all, like every Indigenous folks, I would assume who's seen this would go, that's been there, done that, been in the back of that van. So it's one of those, you know, if you're from the States, in the history of Canada, even in this province, the police killed an Indigenous programmer, shot him, Dudley George. This is about 10 years after, 15 years after this, and that was during a land occupation. You can watch Alanis's most famous movie. By the way, all of Alanis's films are free to watch on the NFB website. You can stream them all. NFB.ca if you are interested. Her most famous film, Ganasatake, 270 Years of Resistance, which takes place at the Battle of the Pines, which Canadians call the Oka Crisis, but the Mohawks would call the Battle of the Pines, which was a land dispute around in just outside of Montreal in Quebec, where the Mohawks occupied their traditional lands that were earmarked to be turned into a golf course. And that became very violent. The Canadian Army was sent in, there was gunfighting, people were beaten, and that's her most famous film. And she was the only journalist behind the protest lines. So her footage of that film, frankly, if that film didn't exist, our understanding of what happened there would have been shaped by the colonial media, which was complete bullshit at that time. Like they were just inventing stuff, and like it was, so yeah, the violence I think was shocking, is still shocking, and sadly is still very normal for what we face. I mean, if you paid attention to Standing Rock in the States, they sent the army there too, right? Snipers there too. You know, I've been in protests in Toronto when we know there's snipers on the roofs. It's just something, I've been on a CSIS list. Like these things happen. If you're an Indigenous person in Canada and you fight, you get on lists.
We have one here.
CSIS is our CIA. It's just for your understanding.
Hey. Oh, can you hear me? Okay, perfect.
Indeed.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, what inspired you to show these films today? And like, because like I was born in 2006, so 1985 feels like a million years ago.
That's very painful for you to have said, but
I'm
sure.
so sorry.
That's all right. I'm in therapy. I'll be all right.
Yeah, basically just like what inspired you to show these films now, and like what would you say like are your goals kind of from like a social justice perspective of showing these films at this time, or do you have one?
Alberto asked me to pick some movies, and these were on the list, along with a whole bunch of other stuff like Alien and stuff that has nothing to do with this. I think Alien's like maybe the greatest movie ever. It's a deeply political movie, Alien, so I'm always interested in speaking about it because I think it's just fantastic. But I put these on any list anytime anyone asks me because they're not seen that much anymore. They are hugely influential in terms of their impact. Like their impact far outreaches their very modest presentation. Like these are small budget, short films that have influenced generations of Indigenous folks to get into film, including me. And Alanis is like my mentor and my hero and a very good friend, and I love her. And I would want to show her movies any chance I get. And Merata, I love her and her family, and so like these are like friends and like kin to me, my aunties or my grandmothers, and then like it did strike me watching them that for Canadians it might be interesting to understand that when you get into treaty with imperial powers, that doesn't always end up well. And that Canadians, unfortunately, in this moment, might be figuring that out. And what I would suggest to Canadians is that there's people that is their lived experience living among you right now. And there's people who live with Canadians among them who've experienced an apocalypse and are still here. And that might be something that Canadians might be interested in how that is. Because a lot of what I talk about these days, because I've done endless talking about truth and reconciliation and this sort of age in Canada. And what I found very interesting is that Canadians are very interested, we've discussed a little bit, in the trauma side of it. But I've always been amazed at the sort of incurious nature that Canadians don't ever wonder, how is it that you actually still have your language? How is it that I can sit here and actually know my community's story and traditions, considering the vast amount of resources that this place spent to make sure no one would ever know any of that stuff? How is it? And I've never been asked that question by a Canadian. Like, how is it? And I find that interesting. I think it's interesting that Canadians aren't interested in that. But I wonder, because there's a prophecy, my people, Anishinaabe people, have a prophecy of this moment that we're in, the prophecy of the seventh fire. And it tells of a time when the world will turn back to learn how to be human again from us. And I think we're maybe in that moment where the world needs to turn back and actually understand what it's facing. Because some people don't realize what they're facing, and some people haven't faced it. And it's this moment to learn to how we actually exist in balance with this place. And so maybe another reason I wanted to show these movies is I want to have that conversation with Canadians. I'm just figuring out a bit how to do it. I do it in my talks, which is, like, okay, I spoke to like 2,000 teachers in Calgary like a couple weeks ago. So there's that. But, it's not broad. But I don't go on, I won't go on a fascist media to do it. So I'm not on social media anymore. I won't. I'm on Facebook because every Indian's on Facebook, okay? But I'm recognized that it's oligarch fascist media, and I'm not particularly interested. I was a big Twitter guy before, Voldemort took it, right? And I did a lot of activism. To be less humble, I would say I think it was effective activism on Twitter. But I was also, as soon as he bought it, I was out. Because maybe one of the gifts of being Indigenous is you have a really quick sense for and I think I have a very deep understanding of this guy and where he comes from, because my people have been dealing with folks like him for a very long time. And I know folks like him, they're our enemy. They're not. He just is. And so I'm figuring out how to have that conversation with Canadians. And the other thing I would say for Canadians in this moment, and maybe this, is that I've been talking about truth and reconciliation for, the final report was 10 years ago? 10 years ago in December. So it's been almost 10 years that I've been doing this work. And it strikes me that in this moment of seventh fire, Canadians seem to be in search of an identity. And it's been my observation that Canadians have struggled to understand their identity in their time here. And I guess what I would like to say to Canadians is that maybe a pathway to understanding your identity has actually already been offered to you through the healing that is on offer through the truth and reconciliation process. Because truth and reconciliation is a healing process, but not for my community. We're healing, and it's a separate thing. It's a healing process for Canada and Canadians, which is sad that Canadians and Canada aren't engaging in it, because it is for you. But it strikes me that in this moment where you're trying to figure out what makes us different from America, this would be something that Americans are never going to do. Ever, 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 ever. They are incapable of it. They're going to have another civil war or continue the one they never finished for it all over again. We are a smaller country, meaning population size. We're much smaller. We have vast amounts of land and resources. If we can't reconcile, I'm not sure that's possible. And I think I would urge Canadians to say maybe this is our identity, is if we go through this process, if we actually do it, including giving back everything that we've taken and figuring out a new way to coexist, a new, how maybe that is the identity we've all been searching for. Right there is your chance to actually be the better people that Canadians have always wanted to be. Because I worry, it's useful in this moment, but I worry that the key part of Canadian identity is simply not being American. Like that's mostly what it is. And that is useful in this moment because it means they don't want to do, but it's a pretty thin wedge if that's what we're relying on. Because I gotta tell you, the difference between Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee ain't just that. It's a whole stratosphere, right? And I think this would be the most un-American thing Canadians could possibly do. And I think it would allow us to be much more resistant to this new era of colonialism than if what we see Canadians doing, which is begging for another king, who I can tell you, because my community signed a treaty with that king's family, they ain't treaty partners you want either. They're liars and cheats. And I'll tell you, the Anishinaabe, and you're on Anishinaabe territory tonight, we've been here for 13,000 years, ain't had a single king once. Never gonna have a king. And I would urge Canadians, that ain't your future either. That's your past, it's time to move past it. And it's time to figure out how we can sit in circle and recognize that our identity, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, all of ours, all comes from the same place and we're all standing on it. And if Canadians could open a window and understand that their identity comes from being in right relations with the land and understanding what that means. Tariffs, no tariffs, some idiot who's like a grifter spouting off nonsense, we would be so resistant to that nonsense. Because I can tell you, I'm unbothered by it. That's just another colonizer saying colonizer things, right? Doesn't bother me, but I see that it disturbs a lot of Canadians. And what I would say is there's a way for you all to understand a little bit and move to here. But it's a healing thing, and you have to engage in it. And so maybe that's why I wanted to show those movies too, is that I'm searching, because I'm not on the radio anymore, where I got my 6 minutes every week to speak to 2 million people, and I took it, but I don't do that anymore. And so I'm trying to figure out how to engage with this dialogue. And what I would say is I'm writing another book. It's a sequel to my first book. It's not, I have to be honest, it's not really about the Trump thing, because like that's, you know how books work. They're like movies. You write them a year and then, but the good news, like I always used to ask when I would, like how your movie is still relevant. Well, yeah, if you make a movie about colonialism, it doesn't matter what year, it's gonna still be relevant 10 years later. We just saw 40-year-old movies still relevant because this shit's still happening today, right? So, yeah, we're in an ongoing sort of struggle, and I'm trying to find the best way to engage in this dialogue. And when fine folks give me an opportunity to have a mic and do this even for, you know, this number of people, I want to have that dialogue, and I want to do it in person. I'm these days, I really think we gotta divest and remember what it is to organize in person. I'm a lot older than you folks. We used to organize, like when we wanted to do it, it was like kitchens. It wasn't online. It was like everyone come to Giselle's kitchen, who's bringing stew, and we're gonna figure out what the protest is, who's getting arrested, who is, like that's what we did. And we can still do that. And the beauty of when you do that is they're not listening, right? And that's how we did it. And it's sort of remembering how. And I think maybe for some younger generations who are used to organizing online, to maybe learn from some of those old heads, it's like, no, there's that, you can do it this way. And it's the same thing. It's like, you're gonna have the same discussion, you're just gonna do it in someone's kitchen. And you're gonna have soup, which is a bonus of the whole thing. And like, but that there's a way to, and I just think also, we need to be in kinship with one another more often. And I think the digital stuff gets in the way. And, you know, it strikes me, we're talking, like Merata and Alanis's friendship was formed across oceans, but they were in person. Like it was an in-person thing. Who, you know, Alanis is not Skyping with anyone. But like, I think there's a lesson in that in terms of visiting and like those sorts of old, like my culture is big on visiting. You know, my grandmother would always have the tea and like the cookie, like it was a whole thing, right? People come over, red rose comes out, like it's a, and I think we gotta stretch some of those muscles again and be in relation close to one another. And for those communities that don't remember, marginalized communities, we still do, like that is sort of central to how we do all this stuff, right? Like I wasn't part of the organizing of Black Lives Matter, but like I was for Idle No More, and I bet they were, but there was all you know, in person with some messaging, but like that's how we roll, and we should get back into that because we're going to have to do a lot of organizing and a lot of gathering and a lot of that stuff, and increasingly I think we're going to want to do it where they can't see. So that's the myriad of reasons why I wanted to show that those movies. We could have talked about Alien, and it also would have been interesting, but everyone's seen Alien. Like Bastion Point probably doesn't leave very often. Like it's very rarely screened. So any chance to, plus I got to see it on DCP, and that restoration was gorgeous. Like the last time I saw that was probably on tape. They would have sent it for the retrospective in 2011, I want to say. And I'm sure Lawrence, Julie, I'm sure Lawrence restored that because that was his gig. Remember Lawrence? You know.
Other questions? Oh, we have one here.
Thank you very much for the movies that you've chosen. I was thinking about the Seven Fires prophecy, and I'm wondering how much two-spirited people will play into that, if it's to work at all.
That's an interesting question. So I would say a couple of things. Two-spirit is sort of a more modern understanding. Anishinaabe do not have two genders. It's just not how we understand the world. So, and I've in all my teachings around it, I've never heard it called out specifically. So that would lend me to suggest they're just there as part of it, as the community as they would be. For Anishinaabe people, so two spirits our naming of like this state of being in modern times, but like in pre-colonialism, there was quite literally a spectrum. I think it's 5 genders or 6, and it's, you know, and there's no gender roles, right? So there wasn't like, we don't do that, and so in my teachings of it, it's not come up, and that's usually because it wasn't like no one was separate or. We are Anishinaabe people. Our philosophy comes from the idea of being and not of doing. Western culture is this culture of doing. Meaning it places the value on what you do, right? Your activity. It's not how we did it. Like if you exist, that's it. You've done the thing. Congratulations. That's the whole point of being human is you're here. How you're here, well, that's the beautiful part. And it's not up to anyone else to determine how you were here. And so it was just a very different worldview. I will ask, because it's an interesting question, but it hasn't been specified to suggest that there was some ceremonial or idea that they would be separate, that they would just be part of the community as we go, if that makes sense.
Questions?
I was killing myself sitting next to Julie to remember because I know Alanis has mentioned it to me, and I don't eat seafood, so we've never gone. It probably is. If it's whatever the famous one that you're thinking of, it's that one. And the way she described it, and I don't know if it's still this way, but the way she described it is like that's where like all the white guys in suits would go to have lunch. And she would take people there to do like that thing. And so, yes, it's whatever that famous one. Whenever I see Alanis these days, she makes me, like, she loves to cook. So I've only ever gone to the Schwartz's deli with her, because everyone goes, you got to do that. But other than that, that's it. We are always at her house eating like brisket. Like, it's just, So yeah, I'm sure it's that restaurant. It's whatever, the one yes, that's the one.
Love that we're like concluding with restaurant recommendations. I think this is perfect.
I think it's still there. Like, I think it's still there. It was still there last time I talked to Alanis about it, which is probably like 10 years ago. It was the restaurants. It's really famous in Montreal. It's the one everyone knows.
You have protest plans. You have recommendations for how to get back together. You have restaurant recommendations. Like, everyone knows what they should be doing when they leave here. This is perfect. This is my ideal film screening. Wonderful. Am I missing anyone? Perfect. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Jesse, for being here.
Thank you. I'll say miigwech, 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 chi miigwech. I say it 4 times to acknowledge all 4 directions. Thanks so much.